Hello and a warm welcome to all the viewers of ETV Bharat. I'm Smita Sharma and we are continuing with our exclusive conversation series focusing on Battleground USA 2020, the big presidential American elections that's going to take place in November in a matter of few weeks now. And today on this episode, the issue that we're going to focus on is something that has been resonating not just in the US, but also worldwide, the issue of race in the race for White House. I'm joined here by Farhana Isfahani. She's a senior, in fact, research fellow for the Religious Freedom Institute, as well as the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Also, I'm joined by Dr. Randall, in fact, Bizak. He is in Portland, in Oregon, and also a sociology professor, a novelist, somebody who has been working a lot on hate crimes. Appreciate you both joining us on this discussion today.
Happy to be here.
Thank you.
You know, the Republican National Convention kicked off. The three-day convention is underway, and this is a physical one, unlike the Democrats who actually went in for a digital conference. And on the first night of the convention, we saw the issue of immigrants, the issue of diversity, the issue of racial injustice being spoken about. But even as the Republican National Convention is happening, remember there's unrest that's flared up once again. And it's just 3 months barely after the death of George Floyd, a black man who was killed because of a white police officer who kneeled on his neck and he was choked to death. So that's where we saw the Black Lives Matter protests, which were triggered off across the nation and also had a resonance in global capitals and global cities elsewhere. Now, once again, that entire unrest flared up as there is this 29-year-old man who has been shot. Fortunately, we are told that he's stable and he was shot by police officers in front of 3 young children. So today, in fact, you know, as we started this discussion, if I could get a sense from you first, Dr. Blazak, because you are in Portland, you know, in this fresh case involving Jacob Blake, what is really the situation on the ground? How polarizing is the atmosphere at the moment?
Yes, the Blake killing sort of helped to revive the protest in Portland. I mean, I think Portland is kind of symbolic of what's happening in the rest of the country right now. It's just a little bit more dramatic because we are Portland. And there is a national reckoning going on with regards to race. I mean, we have had a very poor job dealing with race in America, where there's been no real reconciliation for hundreds of years of institutionalized racism. And so the conversation really shifted in 2020. And I think maybe the pandemic has played a role in it. But the really forefront of the conversation about race is sort of finally happening. And it's happening by white people who are trying to figure out, how do we actually confront this? I mean, if you think about places like Nazi Germany, they've dealt with their history in Germany. If you think in South Africa, they've had racial reconciliation in South Africa. We've never had any real national conversation about race. And it's happening now, whether we want it or not. It's been sort of placed on the laps of white America because of these killings like Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and the Kenosha, Wisconsin shooting that just happened this weekend that was just so violent. And I think Portland is in a unique position because unlike a lot of cities, it's a disproportionately white city. Portland is a white city, and it's white because of its history. We have a history of overt white supremacy in this part of the country. Our state, Oregon, was the only state founded as a white-only state in 1859. So there is this history that builds up to this point, but it gives Portland a sort of a unique opportunity to confront these issues in a way that might not be happening in the rest of the country. So it's added to the conversation, but it's also added to the sort of militant voice that really wants to focus this on around policing and racism. And so that's been the flashpoint. And last night it was quite dramatic in Portland.
I can imagine. In fact, I was looking at the US Census data that was available, which says that Portland, I think, is around 12% Black and 67% white. Farhana, you know, looking at the conversations that are happening, the Democrats' National Convention just got over, the Republican National Convention is underway. Would you say that the racial injustice, the issues of systemic, in fact, racism, is at the heart of this particular race to the White House this time?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I really wanted to focus on systemic. racism, because, you know, we have talked about race in many, many election cycles. I've covered many US elections as a reporter and a producer. So race, we have talked about going, whether it was the Constitution or slavery, the Civil Rights Movement, Martin Luther King. It's not that we've never in America talked about race. And not talked about it in a serious way. And it's not that many, many people have not been shot before by the police. It is not that this has not been at the forefront of many conversations, but systemic racism has been brought in for the first time as being part and parcel of America's history, geography, and who America is today and who America has always been. And that, I think, is what is different. And for the first time, a major American political party has talked about systemic racism, and it is today something that in political service circles, you can deny it or accept it. But through political circles here in Washington, spreading out, fanning out throughout America, you see today through the politicians, to the media, to the American people, people are having to have an opinion on it, come out on one side or the other, but they have to deal with it. And I think Joe Biden's choice of Kamala Harris was an excellent one in several ways. I mean, yes, she is biracial. She is she's a Black woman American. She's a South Asian American. She's the daughter of immigrants. But also she is someone who, when she ran for president, her platform had a lot of these issues to do with systemic racism embedded in that. So by choosing her, I think Joe Biden also has taken this on board.
But Farhanas, you know, on the other hand, do you feel that because we sense that in India too also, you know, when we talk about majoritarian issues or when we talk about minorities here, and we see the kind of polarization that has happened over the past few years. You mentioned that, of course, the race issues is not something that's come up for the first time in American elections. There have been killings of Black people in the past too. But are you worried, you know, the entire sort of focus of the campaign on the first night of the convention, projecting Democrats as absolutely somebody who loves anarchy, or projecting the activists and the protesters on the streets as mobs that are going to come and lynch people. Are you afraid that, or are you, do you see perhaps a greater consolidation thereby happening of maybe the white conservative votes?
I think this is, of course, a valid question and a good question, but I think this is doing something different. A lot of people say of Vice President Biden's generation, who worked for civil rights all their careers, who never saw themselves in any way as being racist, in a lot of ways never even understood how ingrained. Now, I'm talking about somebody who their entire lives has worked within this process. So there are a lot of white Americans also today who are re-examining. There are a lot of white American liberals who say lived in a school district where the schools weren't good, for example, and had overwhelming Black kids or Latino kids. And they would say, no, we'll pay for a private school so our children get a better education. Today, they're looking at it and saying, you know what we did? Fed into systemic racism. So when I talk about the re-examination of this, we're not just talking about white supremacists, and we're not just talking about the looters. There are looters out there who are different to the protesters, and there are white Americans out there who are not all white supremacists. So, I mean, you know, there is a middle class soul in this country, which I think is right now up for grabs. They are grappling with a lot of things and trying to figure out what they want America to be. And I think that's what this election is going to be.
Right. Dr. Blazak, also speaking at the convention was Tim Scott, somebody who had in a way spearheaded the police reforms issues after the George Floyd killing in Minneapolis. And we saw him invoke the names of Breonna Taylor, also of George Floyd himself. He referred to the 1994 crimes bill and Joe Biden's role in it, of which sent out millions of blacks behind the bars. Would you say that really Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are bringing something different on the table on this issue, or is it more really about perceptions and more to do with perceptions, basically?
Well, that's a little bit of both, but I really want to echo the comments about institutional racism and how this moment is different.
Right.
And part of this moment is reflected in that ticket. There are people now who are looking in the mirror about racism, and we have externalized racism. Racism is the Klansmen, or racism is the neo-Nazis. It's not the institutions, including the criminal justice institutions, that in the 70s and 80s and 90s, whether it was Richard Nixon or Bill Clinton, really went tough on crime, especially black crime. We had mass incarceration. We had a quadrupling of the prison population in the 80s and the 90s. It was from both Democrats and Republicans. But we're also doing this sort of internal look. One of the most popular books in America right now is a book called White Fragility, subtitled, Why is it so hard for white people to talk about race? There is this reflective moment that we're in, and that includes people like Joe Biden, who are looking back at his history, and the Republicans love to bring things out that he said in the 70s or in the 80s. And if you brought some of the things that I said in the 70s and the 80s, I'd be quite embarrassed, because I, as an individual, have evolved on the thinking of race. And so we as a nation have this opportunity to personally reflect and evolve and change those institutions. And so what we're seeing, and I think the comments are right, is the Democratic Party is evolving on its thinking about race, being more reflective. One of my favorite things is when people say, I'm not a racist, but, and then they say something completely racist, right? We are really examining that and giving ourselves permission to have that evolution. But what we saw with the RNC this week is there's a real dichotomy. There is a party of fear and there's a party of reflection. And America is a changing place. We are becoming a more brown nation. We're not going to stop that from happening. And so either we can be involved in the pushback against that. Let's go back against that. The tweets from the president about suburban housewives are going to vote for me because I'm going to keep those people out of your neighborhoods. It's like something from the 1950s. And so there's a real difference in not just policy, but how we think about ourselves in this moment. And as someone who's been doing this work for a while, that's new. That we really haven't seen that reflective, even during the Obama years, we haven't really seen that reflective quality and saying, hey, we're going to look at the mistakes that we made. Kamala Harris was a tough on crime prosecutor. And she is now saying, well, I participated in some of that mass incarceration, and we're going to figure out how to change those institutions to make them more equitable. And that is a new term. The term equity is sort of a buzzword. What does that even mean? It doesn't mean equality. It means making up for past inequitable actions. And so that makes this exciting, a very stark, this election, a kind of very stark choice between different perspectives of how we see America, but also how we see ourselves.
But would you say that there's also a difference in terms of course, the immigrant population in America has increased over the years. On the one hand, of course, you do have an America which has been inclusive, which has been accepting of immigrants from across the globe. But there is a difference in the way the older generations are thinking and the younger generations are thinking. Are the demographies approaching the subject differently?
Yeah, I think so. I think we see a real generational difference. The US Census Bureau has predicted that by the year 2050, the percentage of the American pie that's white will be smaller than the non-white pie. So we'll be a majority minority country. And that is seen as a source of excitement for a lot of people, including young people. And that is a source of terror for some older white folks who see their country, something that they created, like they were here in 1776. That their country is somehow being taken away from them. And so they're in a very defensive position to build a wall or create immigration bans or somehow turn back the hands of time and go back to some mythical past when it was a sort of straight white male country and that wasn't being challenged by transgender people or immigrants or Muslims or any of the other populations that are seen as challenging the white majority. And so that's the position that we're in, is there's this desire to go back to this mythical past, or carefully walk into the future and try to make up for some of our past mistakes.
Right. Farhan, as you know, you've been in America for the past many years now. Of course, your roots lie in Pakistan. But when you look back upon and you've worked on minorities, you've authored books on rights of minorities, plights of minorities. I mean, when you look back in the America that you came into first and the America that you're watching today, from your own anecdotal experience or from your own, things that you saw, what is it that you reflect on today when you reflect on these issues of how it's changing, the conversation and narrative is changing?
Okay, I think the point that Dr. Blazak made is very relevant about the younger generations. The America I came to almost 35 years ago, when I was 18 years old, was a very different America, very welcoming of immigrants, but then most of us who came at that time came to study or came from educated families, etc. So the pattern of immigration has also changed. So therefore the reception has changed also. But what you see generationally is something very stark. You see a lot of older people who are very frightened. They are frightened of losing their way of life. They're frightened of losing their God as they see it, their churches, their land, their right to bear arms, and all of that, and cannot cope with this changing landscape. And I think a lot of those people were people who voted for Donald Trump. So it was not necessarily a positive vote, I would say. So there's a lot of fear among those who see things slipping away from them. But among the younger generations, if you look out a lot of the time, you see as many white kids as you do brown and black marching. And I think the younger generations see things quite differently. Their whole thought process is different. You know, they see themselves sexually in so many different.
Right.
For politics as being different in so many ways. So you have a very different young America today. So what's going to happen with this election? Their voice, in a way, let's be honest, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, the strength of the Black Lives Matter movement, which was a fringe movement at first and considered very, crazy by mainstream people and being very angry and aggressive and, that whole sort of stereotype of these angry Black people. Today, Black Lives Matter has had a lot of influence on the Democratic Party. So it is definitely changing of America, and whether we are going to be back to Trump's Make America Great Again or Biden's Make America Better, build a better America, basically, we'll have to wait and see how much the fear factor works like it did the last time after having a Black president who in a way did so much for the economy, did a lot for those who had no insurance, did a lot for Americans. There was such a pushback.
Right.
So we have to, it's going to be a wait and see to see whether it's going to be the opening up of America to a new America, or whether we're still going to hunker down and hold our hatreds within.
Right. So just to get the final comments then, Dr. Blazak, when you look at the issues and you have been looking at hate crime issues for so many years now as a professor of sociology too, where do you think is the one basic reform that is missing? I mean, post what the events in Minneapolis, we heard about police reforms, we heard the calls to defund the police, something that was also looked upon as perhaps an extreme option by many. according to you, what is the one basic big reform that is missing really?
Well, we have an opportunity to do real structural reform. I mean, we sort of fix it around the edges. We have a reform here and a policy here, but to actually sort of look at the institution. And I think I want to echo sort of the theme of this is that we can't really do those institutional reforms until we reform ourselves, until we see ourselves in this moment. I was thinking just with regards to the discussion of generations, the way my father and my daughter refer to these moments. My father told me, Randy, Black Lives Matters means white lives don't matter. And I had to say, no, that's not how it works, Dad. But he sees sort of this notion of his world under threat. My daughter, who's 6 years old, has embraced Black Lives Matter and writes BLM in chalk on the sidewalk. And partially that's because she has Black friends. She has a very diverse friendship group in this neighborhood and sees how they are emotionally impacted. And that emotion is what we would call trauma. We have traumatized people for generations, not just through police brutality, but through the very institutions that reinforce white supremacy. So when we kind of look at our own participation in that, then we can start transforming those institutions. And I feel like that's the moment we're in right now. To do those big changes, we have to work on ourselves.
Absolutely, very valid point in there. Final comments from you, Farah. I mean, do you see any attempt at all as far as Donald Trump and his team is concerned to try and reach out there with a balm to heal? Or is it really going to be about further demonizing in the days ahead during his campaign, is what you sense? Does he really think that, the Hispanics, the Afro-Americans as a vote bank is not going to impact his electoral prospects? Or how is it going to pan out with the Republicans?
I think that Donald Trump is Donald Trump. And I don't think any advisor or anyone else can guide him in any way. So I think the election is going to be the tone you have heard already at the RNC. And I think it's going to continue along those lines. So I wish I could be more hopeful because he could play a much more positive role in making a lot of his base less scared of those who are not like him, and trying to stop doing the otherization. But we will have to wait and see with President Trump, because from day to day, we wait for the tweets, or we wait for the comments, or, it's a mystery to many who are in the party as well.
Yes, but we'll have to also wait and watch as to how it really translates, because in 2016, we had that entire, what was called as the silent voters that finally perhaps came out and voted in support of Donald Trump. And how is this race issue going to sort of translate when it comes to the polarization? And will it actually end up in introspection amongst Americans, amongst the, in fact, immigrant communities to help further integration, as Dr. Blazak pointed out? Importantly, is something that we'll have to wait and watch. And I think, Randy, say hello to your daughter. She showed us a glimpse and ran away, but our hopes always...
I want to end this on something we haven't touched on.
Yes.
The LinkedIn Project. Republicans who have taken ads out in the Wall Street Journal and signed their names, senior members of the military, senior people who have served in Republican administration. These are Republicans to the core. And they are taking exception to some of what the Trump campaign and the president are talking about. So I think we need to, there's a lot happening within the Republican Party, so we should see that as one absolute either. So those same people, the soccer moms, may come out for him again, but they may not.
But, of course, there's a whole lot of churning that's taking place, but I wish we could crystal gaze something that's beyond my scope and capability as a journalist here right now. But appreciate you, Dr. Randall Blazak, and also Farah Isfahani for joining us on this conversation.
Thank you.
And if all of you also tuned into this conversation on ETV Bharat, many thanks. Do stay tuned in for many more aspects of the upcoming Battleground USA 2020.